Good evening. I would like to welcome you to the Krasno Global Events Series. It's wonderful to see so many people for our special event on defending democracy, the global rise to autocracy in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere. We have three outstanding experts today to enlighten us. These are unusual and highly uncertain times. We saw a serious, possibly planned insurrection and the storming of the US Capitol building on January 6. Yesterday, January 13, President Trump became the first president in US history to be impeached for the second time. In 6 days' time, just under a week's time, there will be the inauguration of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as the new president and vice president. Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. resembles an armed camp with over 20,000 soldiers and other security personnel protecting the inauguration ceremony from possible attacks by domestic terrorists. And there, of course, is also the corona crisis and the deep recession of the US economy. So we have lots of problems to deal with. These are very sad days. Democracy is under threat in the United States and many other democratic countries around the world. Fortunately, so far, US democracy has proven very resilient. I'm Klaus Larres, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I've been organizing the Krasno Global Events Series since 2012. As you know, the Krasno events at UNC feature leading experts with a wide range of expertise, and we always talk about issues of global concern. We have a great website, krasnoevents.com, and we also have a very popular YouTube channel, youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. Tonight, we have three outstanding experts to help us understand what is happening in the United States and around the world, and what is the future of democracy, and how can democracy best defend itself. I'm very pleased to welcome Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, Professor Timothy Naftali, and Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat. They are all experienced and insightful scholars. I will introduce them in greater detail before they make their initial remarks. Each speaker will speak for something like 10 to 12 minutes. I will then pose a few questions to each of them to find out more about their views and insights. And then, as always, we will open it up to questions from you, the audience. As you know, we would like you to submit your questions to our panelists by using the chat or Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our two Krasno assistants today, Pete Velasmil and Will Yoder, will select the most interesting questions and read them out aloud. Pete actually grew up in Venezuela, which is also a country known for its coups. And Will is actually a student who recently graduated, and he joins us from Houston, Texas, where he now works in the oil industry. Please don't be shy. Please submit your questions and feel free to ask many lively questions if you can. And can I also ask you to mention your name and perhaps your affiliation or city or country when writing down a question. And please ask short and succinct questions. This would be great. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you tonight to our Krasno event on defending democracy, the global rise of autocracy in the United States and elsewhere. Many of you will be familiar with our distinguished first speaker today, and that is Colonel Larry Wilkerson. I'm pleased to say that Larry was already one of our featured speakers last year. He's a well-known commentator and politician. Larry was Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell from 2002 to 2005, and in his long and distinguished career, he also was Associate Director of the State Department's policy planning staff under Ambassador Richard Haas. Before serving at the State Department, Larry Wilkerson served 31 years in the US Army. During that time, he was a member of the faculty of the US Naval College, Special Assistant to General Powell when he was Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Director and Deputy Director of the US Marine Corps War College at Quantico, Virginia. And Larry retired from active service in 1997. He taught at George Washington University, and at the moment, he is Distinguished Adjunct Professor of Government and Public Policy at William and Mary. I checked on Wikipedia to find out more about Larry Wilkerson, and it said, among other things, that he has shown great concern over President Trump's foreign policy behavior. Larry, it's great to have you back. Please let us know how you interpret the current developments and how concerned you are. Larry, over to you.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be back with you and to be with Ruth and Timothy also. I was going to talk about a number of things we've been looking at William & Mary, one of the most prominent of which is the creeping of authoritarianism, creeping up on liberal democracy, of authoritarianism, even the using of liberal democracy to achieve authoritarianism that seems to be in the West right now. In Europe in particular, in Poland and Hungary, in Ukraine, maybe even Germany. And certainly part of these seminars was looking at the United States too, especially after 2016. But Klaus sort of asked me to talk to 5 points, and I'm going to talk to those points, and I'm sure that Ruth and Timothy will get into some of the other issues. Those points really look at what just happened. And so the first thing I'm going to talk about is what my wife and I saw, as I was talking about before we came on the air, early on the 6th of January, which was the marshaling right down the street from us of some of the elements that you later saw and are still seeing in videos on the television, the storming of the Capitol. That was a traumatic day for us as we watched it unfold. Truly, as you've seen, I suspect, and can interpret from the videos, one that no one knew the outcome of once it commenced. In fact, there were people who were talking about extraordinarily serious outcomes, not to be limited to the capturing of the members of Congress, but also perhaps more deaths than we actually had. It was a riveting moment for us to watch it up close and personal, if you will. Particularly riveting for me because I'd been a member of the National Task Force for Election Crises for almost 2 years. Our principal mission was to study the November 3rd elections as they approached and to make sure, in a very simple statement of our mission, that they were free and fair, and the majority of Americans accepted the results as legitimate. Did we succeed in that mission? We're not sure. But we've been following everything since and have voted just last week that we will stay in being and we will continue to operate to give the Congress the benefit of all the things we learned so that they can change laws and statutes and help the states to do other things, but also so that we can morph into an organization that will be more dramatically and directly aimed at protecting democracy. The other thing I'd say is the theories that have run around are just incredible. Everything from people in the Congress, members of Congress even knew about this and helped to stage it and plan it and to give maps of the proper corridors and rooms to attack and so forth to some of the rioters, to Mitch McConnell, the majority leader in the Senate, wanting this to happen. One person put it to me this way, that he didn't come to praise Caesar, he came to bury him. And this was part of his effort, and it got a little bit out of hand. Having spent almost 50 years around the United States government or in it, military or otherwise, I always vote for incompetence first. And in this case, I think it was principally incompetence in terms of the leaders in the House and the Congress, and I mean McConnell and Schumer and Pelosi and all the rest, for not allowing things to develop a little more robustly ahead of time, suspecting that something, maybe not suspecting this kind of riot, but at least something that would require some more robust security than obviously they had, to the president himself, who apparently, and this is a unique thing for the DC National Guard and what I would call posse comitatus light, which is bringing in Virginia and bringing in Maryland law enforcement to help DC law enforcement. What happened, Americans don't know that the president, unlike any other National Guard in the country under their state governors, unless they're federalized, the DC National Guard is under the president. So he is the commander in chief of the DC National Guard. And it's quite clear that he gave instructions throughout the government that no one was to respond to anything involved with his group marching on the Capitol. If it hadn't been for the Secretary of the Army, who violated that directive and essentially let it happen, we would have not had any late blooming as it was, but still reinforcement of the Capitol Police. There are also some very serious efforts right now looking at complicity within the law enforcement entities, looking at what might have been help from the Capitol Police, for example. I was told yesterday by an FBI source, which I have reason to trust and respect, that right now there are over 70, and they're looking at many, many more, perhaps double that amount, triple that amount, people who were involved, who are people who are either in law enforcement, retired from law enforcement, military, retired from the military, or so forth, that they're looking at right now. So it's a real hodgepodge right now, but the experts, as it were, in law enforcement and elsewhere, security in general, are trying to get to the bottom of it. And they're trying to do it methodically and in accordance with the law, which is the way they should be doing it. What about the second point he asked, Klaus asked me to address, was what went wrong security-wise and why might we suspect more violence? Again, my FBI source tells me that in every state right now, they have thousands of people who are operating in the open, not secure at all, not even slightly secure, just operating in the open on the internet or on cell phone lines or whatever, who by law, once they have overheard what they have said, they are supposed to go to their residence or their place of work and interrogate. But there's no way logistically they can do that. And what they're worried about is this is masking those few, we hope, that perhaps they really should be going to the home or workplace of and interrogating because they really do intend something. This is very disconcerting for the FBI. It's very difficult to deal with, as you might imagine. I suspect that's happening with law enforcement more or less all across the country. So should we suspect or should we expect more violence? The verdict right now that I can sense is about 50-50. The worry is on the side of the 50 that might be for more violence, simply because they don't really know what the extent and depth of it might be. One person put it this way to me, who's an old counterterrorism guy whom I met during the post 9/11 days. He said, look, we know about Al-Qaeda, we know about Jamaat Islamiyah, we know about Lashkar-e-Taiba, about ISIS. We monitor their communications, we know where their leadership is. We really don't know a lot about these people that we're calling now domestic terrorists. They can pop up anywhere and they can be lethal anywhere. They can be a Unabomber here and a Timothy McVeigh there, or a DC sniper here. So they're really worried that they don't have enough intelligence and enough right to act within that intelligence to do something about it. Let me tell you that I'm a little bit worried about what I'm hearing about their needing a Patriot Act for domestic action, because I was there with the Patriot Act's passing, and I was there when not only George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, but then later Barack Obama used that to usurp a lot of our civil liberties, including on occasion due process. So I'm as worried about what I'm hearing about what the FBI needs and what the NSA needs and what others need with respect to domestic surveillance as I was with regard to international surveillance. So this is not a great picture that I'm looking at right now. It would not be surprising that the authoritarianism we fear comes in the back door as we try to deal with those domestic terrorists we've seen reveal themselves of late. And then the next topic Klaus asked me to talk about was impeachment. Well, you probably know as much as I do about that. It is proceeding apace. The 25th Amendment did not work. I have a private story there that might interest the audience. We approached several people around Vice President Pence whom we knew would communicate with him the things that we were trying to communicate. And we thought we had an opening there for a moment, and then all of a sudden it closed. And that, I think, is what you've seen in the public persona of Vice President Pence too. He simply doesn't know what to do. And he is a trademark for my political party right now, the Republican Party. They don't know what to do, many of them. Those like Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz and Florida's Getz and this guy that I didn't even really know anything about until these events began to unfold. His name escapes you right now, but one or two, Gohmert from Texas, three or four, are quite clearly in the group that probably sincerely believe the election was stolen. And that's motivating them. That's driving them on. And it appears that they're willing to do almost anything to get the election back, including negate our democracy. But the majority of the Republicans are concerned about their future. And they're more concerned in most cases right now, at least, about their future than they are about the state of democracy in this country. That's very concerning. It's probably going to cost them ultimately. And I don't really think the Republican Party, as it is right now, consisting of the Freedom Caucus, the Tea Party, the traditional Republicans, who are very few, like Mitt Romney, and others who are trying to decide which place they want to belong in the future, is going to shatter. It's going to be really hard to keep it together. And my Democratic friends say, well, good, that's fine. And I say, we have a two-party system. You want two parties, you want two healthy parties. The Republicans are really searching and looking, as we say in the military, staring at their navels right now. What do they do and where do they go? If they go too ardently, like these half dozen or dozen or so now have gone, Lynn Cheney leading the pack, so to speak. If they go too far that way, as Lynn's polls in Wyoming are showing, they probably have no political future in that particular state. So it's a difficult decision for them. But I don't see the Republican Party surviving this as it currently is. And then in general, where do we stand right now with regard to the Biden administration coming in, taking over, and fluidly, if you will, moving into what it needs to do, both domestically and internationally? I think it's going to be extremely difficult. This transition reminds me in some respects of the transition that we had, the George W. Bush administration, adumbrated, cut down to less than 30 days because of the 9/11 or because of the 2000 election and the arbitration of the Supreme Court and the final decision by the Supreme Court. That's dangerous. It's dangerous because you don't get a chance to do the kind of transition you should. So I'm worried about that. I'm less worried because Biden is very, very experienced. I've known Joe for 29 years or so, I guess. He's a very experienced guy. I'll give you an example. When Powell was Secretary of State, he didn't call Dick Lugar in the Congress, who was then, when the Republicans were in the majority, the leader of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He called Joe Biden. And when Condi Rice, the National Security Advisor, would call him and chew him out for calling Biden instead of Lugar and say, don't you know who the Republican is? Powell would say, yes, and I know who knows the issues, because Joe did know the issues. So I'm not worried as much about Biden because he does have that experience, but I am worried, especially about the national security issues. And I'll close with, I'm worried about those national security issues for a number of reasons, but one of the most prominent ones is that Mike Pompeo, whom I would not dignify with the name of top diplomatist or dignify with the name even of Secretary of State, he's a thug. He has been laying landmines for Joe Biden everywhere. He has laid one all across the country of Iran, and he is laying a very dangerous one in Taipei, where he has essentially recently taken the wrap off the strategic ambiguity policy completely. And we now have strategic clarity. That is a red line in Beijing. It's just a matter of time until they figure out a way and a technique for crossing that red line. But that means that we're supposed to defend Taiwan. This is a very dangerous thing that Mike Pompeo has done. He's doing it so he can run for president with that as his moniker, I think, in the future. He might not get to that moment when he can run for president if these landmines get initiated by someone. So I'm really worried about the national security issues almost as much as I am about the domestic issues leading off with the coronavirus. We've got to do better with that. And I'll close there.
Yeah, thanks very much, Larry. That was most interesting. Would you regard the whole thing that was a coup, which we witnessed on January the 6th, and how far was the White House involved? Did they know about it, or were they generally surprised by what happened?
I'll invite you to the On Point with Megha Chakrabarti that David Kilcullen, Frank Figliuzzi from the FBI and I did on Monday, if you want to listen to it. We went into this in detail. And I agree with all of the others that it wasn't so much a coup as it was an attempt to steal the election back and to force that through the vice president and the pressure brought on the Congress by those marching on it. And it went terribly awry. And I have difficulty crawling into Donald Trump's mind and thinking that he realized that was a possibility or even a probability. Clearly, the remarks, if you parse them, if you go over them, that he made, lead one to believe that he did know what he was doing, and lead one to believe that he knew that there might be violence and that he condoned that. So that's my personal interpretation of it, though. I'll leave it to smarter people than I and the people doing the investigations to, particularly with regard to impeachment, to come to some conclusions firmer than that. But for me, it seemed like the president was complicit in everything that went on, and that the purpose was to overthrow the results of the election on November the 3rd.
Thank you. So if everything had gone their way and everything had gone wrong for democracy, the certification would have been delayed much longer than just a few hours, but Biden would still be inaugurated, wouldn't he?
That's the way you would like to look at it, even if the Republicans had delayed it 5, 6, 7 days. And by the way, in the task force, we predicted they would delay it at least 3 days, all the way to the 8th anyway. That would have been the result in any event. But if you bring in rioters like that, and they wind up, for example, imprisoning the Speaker of the House, or even worse, and maybe taking out some of the other leadership of the Congress, where do you go from there? And to say that they being the president and people like Miller and Bannon and others, didn't realize that that was a potential outcome is to say that they're even dumber than perhaps some people have thought they were. And I've not at any point in time in this administration thought these people were dumb. Quite the contrary.
Thank you very much. Let's come to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Professor Timothy Naftali. And Tim and I go back many years to when we first met at a very nice conference in Santa Barbara, I believe, in California, sunny California. In the meantime, Tim Naftali has become one of the nation's most well-known presidential historians. He often gives us his always interesting insights on CNN. Tim is a clinical associate professor of public service at New York University. He has written many very well-regarded books, including books together with Alexander Fosenko on the Cuban Missile Crisis and Nikita Khrushchev. And only a couple of years ago, he published a highly relevant book entitled Impeachment, An American History. And Tim knows a lot about this. After all, from 2007 to 2011, he was director of the Richard Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, California, where he tried to deal with the objective presentation of the Watergate crisis, if that is possible. Tim also was director of the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia, and he served as a consultant on the 9/11 Commission, which led to his book on Blind Spot, The Secret History of American Counterterrorism. Tim was born in Montreal and educated at Yale, Harvard, and Johns Hopkins, and he now teaches at New York University and is busy at CNN. Tim, tell us about what you make of the recent developments and how it's going to continue.
Thanks, Klaus. And it's, I wish we were all safely in sunny Santa Barbara at the moment. Well, the first thing I think it's important for us, those of us who observe presidencies, we have to admit that we're dealing with the first draft. We're processing a lot of information. Ruth, from whom we are going to hear shortly, processed a lot of information fast and quickly, and helped guide she basically set in motion, or at least for me, gave me a sense of things to look for as I plotted the course of this particular strongman. But as we come to terms with January 6th, we have to do so with a real sense of modesty, humility. about what it all means. So like many historians, I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about history and give us a few moments in history, not that are parallels, not at all, but help us ask the right questions about what exactly we are encountering today. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is the fact that we Americans have enjoyed what was an unbroken string of peaceful transitions of power in the seat of capital, or at the seat of capital in Washington, D.C., and that was broken on January 6th. There is an exception, of course. The transition that followed the election of Abraham Lincoln was not at all peaceful in the South. During the transition of 1860 to 1861, the South seceded. So you can't describe that as a peaceful transition. But what's interesting is that the much reviled President James Buchanan, considered one of the worst in American history, did not try, even though he bitterly disagreed with Abraham Lincoln's policies, his politics, his view of African Americans or enslaved people. He did not obstruct the transfer of power to someone he bitterly disagreed with. So the transfer itself, though it was fraught, and indeed that's why Abraham Lincoln grew a beard, it was because of the concerns that he might be assassinated before he could take the oath of office. At the center of power, despite the disputes and controversies rife throughout the nation, at the center of power, you had a peaceful transition. Now, why do I bring it up? I bring it up because what we had for the first time in American history was a president who was obstructing a peaceful transition of power. And that changes the calculation and the analysis. This, of course, is the first president to not to gain re-election and then seek to overturn his loss. But the fact that the chief executive, and as Colonel Wilkerson reminded us, the commander-in-chief of the DC National Guard, was trying his best to overturn an election, helps explain some of the basic chaos and incompetence. I share the colonel's sense. I generally look for incompetence too, to explain apparent conspiracies. You have to be extraordinarily professional. I don't say this with respect, just understanding, to mount a conspiracy. And generally, you don't find that, fortunately, in history. So the first moment in history I'd like to point out, because it's relevant to our discussion, is the peaceful, in DC, transfer at a moment where the country was coming apart, 1860-61. Another moment I'd like to mention has to do with the privilege I had or the honor to be the first federal director of the Nixon Library. And those are the difficult days of the summer of 1974. Richard Nixon desperately wanted to stay in power. He did not wish to resign. He certainly didn't want to be impeached or removed. And he did his utmost through a combination of stonewalling and very cynical sharing of information to stay in office. He overreacted, overplayed his hand in the fall of 1973, fired the special prosecutor, ordered the FBI to seize the records of the special prosecutor's office. That's why many Americans were afraid that Nixon was actually going to have all of that destroyed, and then push the country into the first impeachment process in 100 years. Democrats were not calling for the impeachment of Richard Nixon. I should say Democratic leaders. There's always going to be a spare Republican or a Democrat calling for impeachment. We are going to hear a couple of Republicans, at least one, calling for the impeachment of Joe Biden. She's already told us that, just after he's elected. So one or two members of Congress calling for impeachment, that's one of the prices you pay for being president. But the leadership generally does not attempt an impeachment unless they mean it. And the leadership of the Democratic Party was not interested in impeaching Richard Nixon until there was a groundswell of public support for an impeachment process. Americans supported, Republicans and Democrats alike, supported the beginning of an impeachment process. Republicans supported it, not necessarily the ultimate removal of Nixon, but the fact that the process was necessary to get to the bottom of what had happened. So the process itself was bipartisan from the beginning. That doesn't mean the Republicans were prepared to remove Nixon. It gives you a different sense of the first, I'd say it gives you a context for the first impeachment of Donald Trump, and gives you, I think, some explanatory context for this second one that we've just witnessed. Nixon fought back, and ultimately his support eroded. During the period that his support was eroding, what we know from, actually I learned this after I left the job, from diaries of top Republicans, is that they wanted him to resign. He was a stain on the party. They were concerned about the 1974 midterm elections. They wanted him gone. And they tried ways to encourage him. This is before any articles of impeachment were voted. They tried to find ways to send signals to him to leave for the sake of the party. It backfired. They did it. The press, of course, covered it. And rank and file members of the Republican Party went to the leaders and said, "You're killing us. You're going to kill the party. Our base loves Nixon." And they were afraid. Now, I'm not saying they were fearful for their lives. That comes later. That is going to happen in this story. But they were afraid politically. They felt the party could not survive if its leadership turned against the president, even though the leaders of the party were quite convinced Nixon was guilty. So you had a period of months when privately they are discussing the fact that this man has got to go. But their rank and file members say, "Don't do it. Let the Democrats push for this." There's a sea change that occurs because as the evidence flows to the House Judiciary Committee, Southern Democrats, who, by the way, are the most important players, people talk about Barry Goldwater and the leadership of the Republican Party. Richard Nixon never relied on Republicans in the Senate to save him. His line of defense was the House. Why? Because he had changed the politics of the Republican Party, and he saw Southern Democrats as future Republicans. That he expected to stay because of the solid South. And that was his key relationship. And the key player was a man named George Wallace. George Wallace was Richard Nixon's key to holding on to the presidency. And George Wallace turned against Nixon in the summer. And when that happened, Nixon told his chief of staff, "That's it, I've lost the presidency." Well before Barry Goldwater. I know the myth of how this happened, but the reality was the balance of power in US government were the Southerners, the Southern Democrats. They turn against Nixon in the summer. And some extraordinarily courageous Republicans, conservatives and liberals alike, also turn. But it is with the release of the transcript of the smoking gun conversation, the tape itself wasn't released in '74, that the last support for Nixon evaporates. The point I want to make here is 2 points. One, that leaderships of parties can understand the president is guilty, is a criminal, but won't do anything. In our history, generally speaking, parties, even when they know the leader is a criminal, will not do anything. Secondly, there was a moment in the summer of '74 when Richard Nixon could have pulled a Donald Trump. And that's why the two men are fundamentally different. I'm no fan of Richard Nixon's abuse of power. And one of the things I hope I did as director of the library was not only to make more material available, but to have public history accessible to students on the web and in the building that was fully honest about the nature of Nixon's crimes against the American people. But Richard Nixon had expected the Supreme Court to vote in his favor. At the very least, in the case US v. Nixon, he expected that there would be an exception for national security. That's what he banked on. Because his cover-up, he's very clever. He had designed it, the cover-up was designed to push criminal information under the rubric of national security and then keep it classified and make sure Congress didn't get it. And he hoped that the Supreme Court would say that all material except those required to keep secret because of national security should be shared with the special prosecutor. And Nixon was going to use that exemption to prevent all the material that would convict him from getting to the special prosecutor. But the Supreme Court didn't rule that way. In a unanimous decision, it said everything that the special prosecutor wants should go to the special prosecutor. When that happened, Nixon could have said no. And he thought about it. And we don't know to this day the full story. We know the outcome. The full story of those hours, we probably won't, because I think if there was a diary from one of the players, it would have turned up by now. But I'm always hopeful. But Nixon initially wanted to say no to the Supreme Court. Now imagine what that would have been like for the United States if one of the co-equal branches had said to the Supreme Court, I don't agree. You might say, well, the president has to listen to the Supreme Court. Actually, there's nothing in the US Constitution that says that the president of the United States has to obey the Supreme Court. In fact, if you look at the Constitutional Convention, when they talked about the president's use of veto, he was going to be, with the Supreme Court, an adjudicator of the constitutionality of the laws of Congress. He could find laws, congressional acts, or bills actually, unconstitutional. It's with Marbury versus Madison from John Marshall that the Supreme Court says, no, we are the supreme adjudicator of the constitutionality of laws and actions. But that's not set in the Constitution. Nixon played with the possibility of saying no. He didn't. And that is how you should view January 6th, in my view. Donald Trump, like Richard Nixon, in a corrupt way, put pressure on every single point, every weak point he could find in our constitutional system. Richard Nixon reached a point where he realized that if he did it yet again, the system could collapse. And he said no. His January 6th was, I think it was July 24th. I have to double check, but maybe I think it was the 24th, July 24th, 1974, when US v. Nixon was decided. And he said no. He didn't want to do it, but ultimately he did the right thing. Donald Trump didn't. Donald Trump, in the morning of at 1 o'clock on January 6th, learned from his vice president that the vice president was not going to find a new constitutional role for himself during the electoral count. That was Nixon's that was Trump's US v. Nixon moment. There were no other options. The Supreme Court had already decided against him. This was it. Was he going to accept that he'd run out of constitutional options? And the answer was no. And how do we know the answer is no? Because he had an opportunity to tell his mob to leave the Capitol. And he didn't until hours later. That's another way of thinking about this. And the last thing I want to mention, the last historical moment I want to mention as a way of framing the issues we're facing today is Oklahoma City bombing, the Oklahoma City bombing of 1995. I had the good fortune to be a consultant to the 9/11 Commission, and I wrote an unclassified history of how our country, our government, our federal government, thought about the issue of terrorism from the rise of international terrorism in arguably 1967, 68. And my brief was through Clinton. Certainly through that first half of Clinton, but I just did the whole of the Clinton administration. What's relevant to our discussion today is is something that the Colonel mentioned about the Patriot Act. I'm sure the Colonel knows this. There were elements of the Patriot Act that were written by the Clinton administration. And they were written after the Oklahoma City bombing because of the challenge of collecting information on domestic terrorists. And Congress, especially Speaker Gingrich, but not only Speaker Gingrich, opposed increasing the power of the FBI to investigate terrorism. They opposed it because they saw it as a way to limit actually Republican freedom, because the anti-Clinton element was largely or identified with the Republican Party. I think it's, I'm not saying they're Republicans, but their rhetoric, they found a home in the rhetoric, certainly of the Gingrich Republicans. And the Republican Party was not trying to protect terrorists. But when the issue is domestic terrorism, our system, because of checks and balances, it's very difficult. It is not easy for us as Americans to deal with. Now, part of the reason is the crimes and abuses of previous administrations. The FBI's infiltration of the Black Power movement, the mistreatment of the Civil Rights movement, the attack on dissenters in the Vietnam era, the role played by the US Army in investigating dissenters. We sadly have a history in certain periods, I don't want to say always, but we have a history of the federal government abusing its investigative and intelligence function at home. So it's a very difficult balance, but it is a balance that we have to achieve. And it's something it's hard for us to talk about because it gets very political very fast. So if you want to see a previous period where we had to deal and talk about these difficult issues, look at the congressional debates in 1995 and 96 and what President Clinton was trying to do. I suspect we're going to see some of that again. So my last point is this. There are two major challenges. One is with regard to Donald Trump as a demagogue of anarchy, and I would certainly argue on January 6th of acts of terrorism. What do we do with a fallen demagogue? And Ruth, it's the best in the world to talk about that. But I would just tee up that maybe in the Q&A we can talk about impeachment. I'm happy to talk about the impeachment and the trial that may come. Let me just say that my last point is that I supported impeachment this time too, because if you didn't act on what he did January 6th, then impeachment has no content whatsoever in our Constitution. But I also believed it was necessary to start the process of de-radicalizing the Republican Party. I believe, and this is a very hard thing to talk about, because we use this term with regard to Islam, and there's wonderful work. The Army's Combating Terrorism Center has phenomenal articles about de-radicalization. There was a very interesting interview with the head of MI5, the British Domestic Security Service, about de-radicalization in Britain. This is a very difficult subject. It also suggests the possibility of abuse. So we have to be mindful as we talk about it. And many Americans are not going to want to believe that they would be even considered within the realm of de-radicalization. So I'm saying this with complete understanding and sensitivity. But in fact, the challenge is de-radicalization. The effect of 4 years of disinformation is that a large percentage of our country is in an alternative universe which has been turned towards anti-constitutional ends. And we just have to admit that that this is a challenge. Now, I don't believe the answer is top down. I don't believe that our president can set a new tone and will. And I assume that he will take some of the toxicity out of the air. But I believe the Republican influencers And local officials and local leaders of faith communities are the keys to this. And this is not a 10-day project. This is a year project that will be years, I think, in the making. It's a big challenge, but I suspect it is our greatest civic challenge at the moment.
Thank you very much indeed. This was very, very interesting. As you say, when Trump said no to the Constitution on January 6th at 1 p.m. more or less, and at the same time or shortly after, Vice President Pence adhered to the Constitution and discovered his constitutional heart, why did he then not eventually remove Trump from power?
Oh, you're asking
by invoking Amendment 25.
Well, Klaus, at the risk of, this is not a perfect parallel, but one of the things that I've learned from my studies of foreign affairs is that the United States, time and again, when it's been ready to shift its support from a dictator, has found it very hard to discover around the dictator strong people who are willing to replace the dictator. I'm thinking of Iran, and I'm thinking of the effort, I think of General Heiser mission, to try to find a general around the Shah who would be willing to put together a caretaker government. And this wasn't the only place we found this. Americans found it. I wasn't there, but it's that authoritarians do not pull together inner cabinets of strong people. And Ruth knows more about this than I do. So I would never have predicted that Pence would do it, because the fact that Pence didn't resign over the 4 years was evidence to me that he didn't have the guts to do it, number one. Number two, he can't do it alone. He needed a cabinet. And there's no doubt that there was a desire in the cabinet to do something, but the two people in the cabinet, oddly enough, who might have done something, resigned. Betty DeVos and Elaine Chao. They would have voted against Trump, but they resigned. So it seems to me that there will be a story about cabinet discussions, and Donald Trump managed to put together a cabinet of people who were too weak and too afraid and probably too disinformed to act on behalf of the country.
Thank you very much. Yes, I would agree with that. Thank you very much. Our final speaker tonight is Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat. Ruth has just recently published a great book on Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present, which has been immensely popular. This book, Ruth's website says, is a first study to place Donald Trump in the context of a century of authoritarian leaders that use a playbook of corruption, violence, propaganda, and machismo to stay in power. I think Ruth will be able to enlighten us a lot today. Ruth is a modern historian and cultural critic, and not least, she's a historian of fascism, authoritarian leaders, propaganda, and threats to democracy. She's a professor of history and Italian studies also at New York University. She also is a very busy commentator, also working for CNN and many other national and international media outlets. Ruth comes from an Israeli-Scottish family, grew up in California, and was educated at UCLA and Brandeis University. And we greatly look forward to your insights, Ruth. Over to you.
Thank you. It's been very interesting to hear the commentaries so far, and I think we'll have a good discussion. So I'm starting with a quote. Our expectation is that somebody may try to kill us. And this is a quote from Representative Peter Meyer, a congressman from Michigan who voted to impeach Trump. And he's buying body armor and upping his security details. And this is a fitting end to a presidency that brought an authoritarian political culture to America, from his earliest campaign boasts of shooting someone to the imposition of loyalty criteria for serving him, making sure that anyone who became his opponent suffered the consequences. And it's all the more telling that Meyer is not a Democrat, but a Republican. So you have this authoritarian dynamic of somebody guilty of internal dissent and insubordination to the leader. All of this might sound like a scene from a gangster movie, or from Russia under Putin. And indeed, the glorification of violence and legitimation of lawlessness is a hallmark of a liberal rule. And it looks different in every country. You have Erdogan in Turkey, who imprisons thousands upon thousands on trumped-up charges of terrorism. You have Putin, who sends dissenters to penal colonies in Siberia and elsewhere that doesn't get enough attention, and uses political murder, poisoning and assassin and guns, both practices inherited from communism. And it's fitting that Trump would harness existing racist and anti-democratic and extremist movements. And this is what these men do when they come to power. They legitimize all the existing anti-democratic and violent and extremist tendencies that were in the country, and they give them focus and they add a leader cult. And he added to this new political enemies, the press, political opponents, and anybody who poses a danger to his intent right now to continue in power illegally. So as is evident, my take on Trump and events, it takes from my research on authoritarianism and my belief that illiberal politics are the best frame of interpretation for much of what he's done. Trump never intended to govern as a democratic president with a small d in the tradition that we've known. His goals and priorities never had anything to do with public welfare or really bipartisan governance. He was never going to be the president of those who didn't care for him, only those who would submit to him. And he was empowered to turn office, like this is a typical authoritarian corruption, to turn public office into a money-making machine for Trump organization. And so when people say he's lazy and he just goes and golfs all the time, this is when you see it from authoritarian corruption lens, spending 1 out of every 3 days in office visiting and promoting a Trump-branded property is actually hard work toward that goal of making money. His other goal was to build his personality cult. He's been phenomenally successful at this, to keep people loyal to him and seem invincible, and to spread hatred because leaders like Trump depend on the pernicious effects of polarization. And so what was touched on before with Pence being too weak, one of the things I really didn't expect to find this as such a continuity in my tales of governments from Mussolini up to Trump, is that all of them construct these kind of cocoons or inner sanctums that they have around themselves, sycophants, flatterers, family members. So I have, in the book, I have a paragraph about sons-in-law, from Mussolini's Ciano up to Jared Kushner. And of course, the purpose of these people is to become co-conspirators, but also to shield him from any information he doesn't want. And so this ultimately leads him to make bad decisions. But nobody, the fastest way to get demoted is to be too strong of a person, too principled or too popular. So the Pence fits in here. When he was humiliated, when Trump announced he was going to be his vice presidential candidate and he humiliated him, that was the first test. Was he going to stick around and be cowed and subordinate to Trump? And he passed that test. So the events of January 6th, I am going to talk about them, were a wake-up call for many to the dangers Trump represents. And they showed, like none other, his scorn for American democracy, its norms and its customs, including the idea that the loser of the election would give the winner the respect of vacating office. And democracy is an honor system to some extent, and men like Trump are not men of honor, other than in mafioso terms. And that's why once they get into power, it's very, very difficult to get them out. And when I had to turn in my book in the summer, I, of course, didn't know what would happen to the election. So my last words about Trump was that never underestimate, tenacity to stay in power by any means. And he wasn't going to leave quietly. Of that, I was sure. And this is because of the way that they're very different than Democratic with a small d leaders, who see their departure from office as a new stage in their lives. They're going to build on their legacy. The authoritarian regards the loss of adulation and control of resources and bodies and attention and immunity from prosecution as a kind of existential threat. And this is why they are supremely unprepared to leave office, and also because of these cocoons they have. They're the last ones to know when the jig is up sometimes. And so they turn to desperate measures. And there's even a term for this in political science. It's called gambling for resurrection. So some of them start wars, some of them plan coups, and they sabotage the next government coming in. Pinochet in Chile did this. He's interesting because he was voted out of office by plebiscite, but he had a whole year before the first democracy would start in 17 years. And he spent the year trying to sabotage the government, stacking the Supreme Court and passing laws so that his torturers couldn't be prosecuted as easily. So the history we've been living since Trump lost the election and the events of January 6th, when, the storming of the Capitol, they fit this pattern. And I want to pay close attention to them because not only because they've had the support of hundreds of Republican politicians and voters, but they draw on anti-democratic actions across the century, and they could be normalized in the future, part of the way the GOP conducts its business as a far-right party. So first you had, and the summer events with the flooding of DC with all kinds of different troops and law enforcement, some unmarked. This was evoking, he was exploring, military intervention until General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, shut that down. But this is, harkening back to the age of the military coup and then the famous op-ed by Tom Cotton, let's bring in the military. And I was following this civilian-military relationship very closely, given that I have a chapter on military coups in the book. And he also attempted the favorite 21st century despot trick of electoral manipulation. We all know pressuring Georgia Secretary of State and others to find votes. And this is how authoritarianism already operates in Putin's Russia and in Erdogan's Turkey. And these are leaders who Trump really admires. And Erdogan doesn't get enough attention as a role model for Trump. He was the leader that Trump talked to most often. And we think more about the Putin Trump relationship, but Erdogan was the person he consulted with most often. And the danger in the future is that election results that don't go your way become just another piece of information to be denied and replaced with a fabrication that suits the false reality you need to stay in office. And that it didn't work makes it no less dangerous, because with the right players, the game could have succeeded. And other people, the Hawleys, the Cruzes, and others are watching, we're watching this very closely to see what the space of maneuver will be. So finally, he channeled in a way early fascism in calling on these extremist paramilitary groups, these non-state actors, although we learned there's people from our state institutions mixed in. And for years, he's posed as, quote, their man to cultivate their loyalty. And he always uses the we. I've been very interested as a scholar of fascism originally in how he built community and made these people feel special. And he tells them, I love you. You are special. We are on this journey together. And so I'm reminded with this flooding into all these, this armed march that's being prepared for January 17th, these black shirts and brown shirts that used violence to defend their leaders, Mussolini and Hitler. And the other part of this is very important, isn't just the personality cult, but the fact that he is a victim. This is very important in authoritarianism. The leader is the aggressor, but the leader is always the victim. Erdogan talks about witch hunts against him. So this was a mobilization of the ultra faithful to defend their leader in distress, and so stop him from being robbed. That's something that's rightfully his, the election. And of course, Trump was nowhere to be seen. He watched it on television, as we all know, even as his own supporters, as well as Capitol Police, were injured. And this goes with the kind of use and discard philosophy that these men have. And he delayed any call for insurgents to disperse, and the colonel has gone over that until, and it was interesting that enough tangible televised destruction and trophy photos were taken, and those are very useful for extremist recruiting purposes. And so it's not surprising that some extremists seem to have understood his January 7th speech, which ended with the chilling sentence, "Our incredible journey is just beginning," as another version of the stand back and stand by comment he made to the Proud Boys at a September 2020 rally. And so then you have plans, of course, for in our near future, other armed marches. So if these violent attacks on government buildings become our new reality, it'll be a testament to Trump's success in legitimating extremism and giving it a focus. And I am worried about this new phase that will open. Our journey is only beginning, which is, a strategy of tension where you create chaos with violent acts, so that the Biden administration seems not only he's an illegitimate leader, but seems to be incapable of governing, right? And the Trump administration's been trying to sabotage the Biden administration every which way. Talked about foreign policy, but also inaction on coronavirus. But it's very important psychological warfare that has been waged on the American people for 4 years. And in this next phase, helped by right-wing media, it could really create a sense of an ungovernable America under democratic rule. And the purpose is to create an appetite for law and order rule, authoritarian governance, so that the Republicans can come back, recapture the White House in 2024. And then many people say a more competent authoritarian could come in. So I am worried that, as far as the future of Donald Trump, he could be, once he's unleashed from the White House, he could easily act as a kind of agitator. That's his best talent, propagandist and agitator. He's not very good at making money in the end, and his businesses have failed, but he's a very good agitator because he speaks the language of emotion very, very skillfully. So he could work with extremists inside the Republican Party and out to further destabilize American democracy. And this matters, this end game, because although it's, might be comforting in a twisted sense to think of these assaulters on the Capitol as ragtag outliers, the more, that comes out about who participated, it's many, many people from inside our institutions, from law enforcement, from military, Republican officials. And so the threat to democracy is inside our institutions, inside the building, so to speak, not just outside. And if there's a silver lining to conclude in all of this, it's that Trump has left us a roadmap of the potholes and weaknesses in our democracy and in our institutions. And, impeachment sends a very strong message, and Tim talked about this, but we also need to reverse the culture of secrecy and corruption that Trump succeeded in installing across federal agencies. I'm very concerned about, we haven't even begun to digest the scope of what, and I agree, Pompeo is a thug. And there's the little Pompeos all over, the Millers, the Barrs, all these people who have politicized and deprofessionalized federal agencies. And this is one of the saddest things that happens when you have real dictatorships over the long term. The army and the bureaucracy, civil service becomes deprofessionalized. And I have a lot of testimonies in my book of people saying, how did we let this happen? What were we thinking? So the State Department and the Department of Justice should have priority to send a message to our allies that America is back, as a fan of democracy, and that Trump did not succeed, in fact, in realigning the country with the forces of global autocracy, which I truly believe was one of his aims. So I will stop there, but I want to end on a positive note because if you look at the history, the sad, destructive history of authoritarianism, we did something that is very rare. We interrupted a process of authoritarian capture because we voted him out. And that is something that not many can claim. So we have to hold fast to that.
Thank you very much. It's always good to have a bit of optimism involved as well, and I quite agree. So would you regard, in the end, essentially, would you regard Trump as a fascist leader on the model of Mussolini and other predecessors? My second question, do you have more information on Putin and Trump's fascination with Putin, and can we expect Trump to be offered political asylum in Moscow eventually?
So I don't use the word, I don't call Trump a fascist. Many people do. Even the distinguished historian Paxton, retired from Columbia, finally came out and said, yeah, maybe he's a fascist. But because I use the word authoritarian, because fascism was the first stage, along with early communism, of this broader authoritarian system. And as I demonstrated with looking at how just these events of January 6th, and since the election, he lost the election, they take from a larger history than just fascism. Many of the things Trump does were originated by fascism, the leader cult, and also early communism, the propaganda, the facility with the crowd, the rallies, all of this harks back to fascism. But what Trump, the culture that Trump has brought to America, and the people who he has around him are part of a larger history. I had not realized that until I did the research for the book, that Roger Stone and Paul Manafort had a lobbying company, and they worked for a bunch of dictators. And they have decades of experience with psychological warfare and electoral fraud. They worked for Mobutu. They worked for Ferdinand Marcos and they were hired, I found the Foreign Agents Act. They were hired specifically to work his a snap election in the mid-'80s that turned out to be like totally fraudulent. And then there's Steve Bannon, who's now coming back in the picture, which I thought was just chef's kiss, just perfect, that this, far-right propagandist, destroyer comes back at the 11th and a half hour. They're supposed to be reconciling. And Bannon has decades of experience as a propagandist against democracy. So it's larger than fascism, actually, the playbook that he is evoking, I would say.
Okay. Briefly, a word about Putin and Trump before we go and open it up to questions.
I mean, I'm not an expert on Russia. I start my book with a comparable relationship, but also quite different, with Berlusconi and Putin. But Berlusconi, in fact, the opening scene of the book is Berlusconi's with an escort the night of that Obama gets elected. He's married, but he's with an escort. And he tells her to wait for him in the big bed. And she says, Putin's bed, because Putin gave Berlusconi a bed. And Berlusconi gave Putin a duvet with their faces on them. So they were very, very close. But Berlusconi was never in debt to Putin, because Berlusconi actually was a successful billionaire, but very tied. And so this with Trump has been a client, a client-master relationship rather than a relationship of equals. But the whole Russia thing, I don't think we have time to get into it now. It's very complex.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Let's open it up to questions. There are plenty of questions already waiting for us. Pete, would you like to ask and select and ask the first question?
Yes, I would be very happy to. We have a question from Richard Ellman, and we'll direct this to Dr. Naftali. Were Donald Trump to go on national television and say that he lost the election and that there was no fraud, would that somehow diffuse the rioting and the concerns of rioting from his followers?
Well, that actually was a recommendation that Karl Rove made in the Wall Street Journal, I think, today. It's something similar. I'm sure it would help. I think Ruth, I keep bouncing this to Ruth because I think the importance of the demagogue, the importance of Trump as the idol shouldn't be underestimated. I'm persuaded that if Pence had tried to talk to the movement would have rejected Pence. And in fact, some of the rioters were in fact trying to find Pence. So that that only Trump can turn the movement, and nobody around him can turn it. But the question is it possible the movement could transcend the master? And Ruth would understand that better. What I know for a fact is that it would certainly help law enforcement and bring the temperature down in the Capitol if he did the patriotic thing and went on TV and said it. I mean, he's just issued a statement. What's very strange about Trump at this moment is that he's complaining about losing Twitter, and that's part of the victimhood business. But he has the best platform. He has the platform that every previous president had at their disposal. They weren't waiting they didn't use Twitter to give people a sense of the thinking of the chief executive. He still has that platform, and every flat screen in the world would be turned to him if he said he was going to make a speech to the nation. So I hope he does. I don't expect him to.
A quick follow-up question. You mentioned briefly the statement the president released yesterday, and Dr. Ben-Ghiat, I'd like to get your thoughts on this too. Do you think that was enough, or what would you have liked to have seen differently or added to that statement to help ease tension?
Well, I don't. He never admitted error once in his time in office. Never. By the way, I think in his world view, he has conceded, because generally when he faced pushback, he doubled down. I think admitting that the violence that occurred at January 6th wasn't done by Antifa, wasn't done by anarchists, which some of his supporters said. And then now, to be fair, Minority Leader McCarthy said that's not true, but a number of the Republicans who spoke on behalf of the president yesterday tried to deflect responsibility for January 6th. I think he has to say, I didn't want you to do that. I am ashamed of you. You are no longer the people I expect. I don't, because his first words to them was, I love you. He said, don't hurt police officers. By the way, he didn't say don't hurt members of Congress. He said, don't hurt police officers, and I love you. So, no, he has to denounce those people as the Godhead. He has to denounce them. He has to get them, he has to ostracize them from the community. And then he has to say that he lost the election, there was no fraud, and the country needs to heal.
Thank you. Lawrence, can we expect that he will ever say that?
I listen to all these remarks with some fascination, particularly because we've been in a group having a discussion about fascism. And I find Ruth's remarks enlightening to the extent that I'd love to go into a deeper conversation about it. I think we have an ingredient we haven't even dealt with, two ingredients we haven't even dealt with that are serious, and Trump made them even more serious, more profoundly serious, and they'll still be with us. And the president of the Ford Foundation, in his statement right after the 6th of January, highlighted one of them. The greatest threat to democracy in America is white supremacy, and the greatest threat to white supremacy is democracy. That is a description of my Republican Party after, as Timothy said, Richard Nixon got through with his Southern strategy. The second thing we haven't talked about is the third Great Awakening. We have, according to the census, 100 million self-identified evangelicals in this country, of whom I would submit 40 to 50 million constitute the very core of Trump's base. Neither of these groups is going away, whether they have Trump as their leader or not. And that is as disturbing to me for the future, not only Biden's administration, but beyond that even, as anything we've talked about so far.
Thank you.
Can I add a word about that?
Sure.
One of the recurring things in authoritarian history is that religious institutions will, a part of the personality cult is that he's a man, like man of the people, but he's a man that stands above all other men. And he's acclaimed by a divine, he rules with divine mandate. And he's the only one because of this that could see where things are going. And this is repeated in different circumstances over and over. But the irony is that sometimes the people who are bestowed with this honor are the most profane and impious transactional, immoral individuals that there are. And this started with Mussolini, who was a known atheist and anti-clerical and hated the church. And he was the one who the Vatican allied with, and they did their Lateran Accords, and they got a lot out of the relationship. And Trump has delivered hugely for white Christians and evangelicals, and in his kind of revolution of government. But he too is like the last person you might expect. And that's because these men are amoral and they will ally with anyone to get what they want. They actually end up having these, evangelicals and gangsters and this and that who have nothing to do with each other. And Berlusconi was exactly the same with the Catholic Church and Opus Dei. There's also a sub-theme of Opus Dei, and many members of the Trump administration are this extreme Catholic set, from Bill Barr, Pat Cipollone, and they run through from Francisco Franco and Bolsonaro and Pinochet. So religious benediction and religious support is really important for their personality cult, and these cults stay on even after they leave office sometimes. That's the key too. So that's what the colonel is saying, they're not going away, but their worship of Trump may not go away either.
Thank you. Will, can we have the next question? Will has disappeared. Yeah. Oh, there he is.
So David Litt asks, who specifically are the influencers and opinion leaders who can contribute to the de-radicalization of the American right, and what would be necessary to motivate those influencers to do that, and where would that motivation take place?
Let's start with Tim here.
Well, I think that pastors, to pick up on what the colonel said. By the way, I'm not saying that they will, but we have to start somewhere. And I mean, if this is why it's I believe a huge national problem that won't go away, as I said, for a number of years. But I think local leaders, pastors. I think that corporate America has weighed in. I believe the decision by many companies to shut down their PACs influenced Republicans in the last days. So I think that moderate people who worry about chaos in corporate America can help this process by shutting down the money. But it's a long one. And, how do you get Franklin Graham to embrace the reality of today? I don't know. His father was a complicated but patriotic man who actually resisted, for the most part, overt political, the kind of political gamesmanship that his son, I'm talking about Billy Graham, and his son is engaged in. But I don't expect right-wing commentators who make money selling vitamin supplements to be shifting, because their business model actually is based on outrage. But I think there are community leaders and who can begin the process. I also have hope for the future for younger people, millennials and younger people. I think the key will be to see if we can avoid radicalization of people under the age of 20. People over the age of 50 may be too late. but the future are people who are 20 years old. And I have now I'll admit that the students I encounter at NYU are not necessarily representative of students throughout the country. Ruth will attest to that. But I get a sense among my students that even those who identify as conservative, and I get them in my class, at least because I talk about power and study international relations, that they're I don't sense an authoritarianism among them. So I think young people could be the solution, and it's going to take a generation.
Thank you. Anyone else who would like to come in?
I'd like to add what Timothy said with regard to the different leaders that might help this situation, the military. I know it's a test of civil-military relations right now. One of the reasons General Milley is, it's not just his conscience and his allegiance to the Constitution that keeps him from wanting to have active duty military involved in anything domestic. It's also because there are lots of questions about some of the ranks in the military and what they might do. And proselytization in the military and sects like the Dominionists in the military permeate every rank. There are 3-star generals who are adamant Dominionists, and there are privates, and there's every rank in between. So we need a leadership in the military that doesn't necessarily crack down on this, but they darn sure need to enforce the regulations that separate church and state within the ranks of the military. And frankly, they've been very reluctant to do that because they feel like it'll be more rancorous than it will be helpful, but they've got to do it.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's have the next question, Pete.
Yes, I'll direct this to Colonel Wilkerson. I think it's a question that's on a lot of people's minds, actually. This is from Dorothea. What do you see as the goal of the acts of January 6th? Were those who organized it seriously thinking that they could stop the vote and the transfer of power?
I think that's a complex answer. I think there were probably as many goals as there were people there. And just watching the videos, you can see that. Some are just strap hanging and taking pictures with their cell phones. Others are very athletically ascending walls, and still others are breaking down windows and looking for direction to the key spots. And that might have been one of the saving graces, is that it didn't seem to be well led. It didn't seem to be professionally led in terms of a real mission and accomplishing that mission. And I think that's a product of the disparate groups that were there. Some were even just hangers on, probably. If it were, as Ruth said earlier, if we had better leadership here, my God, this could have been a lot worse, a heck of a lot worse.
Thank you. Will, can we have the next question?
Okay, there's one that is anonymous that I will rephrase, but for length. But if Trump's victory in 2016 was sort of a populist response to a broad-based, but not just right-wing political dissatisfaction among a large portion of Americans, how would each of you rate the political establishment's response to that, and specifically the Democratic Party's response to that to the rise of populism?
Ruth, do you want to address that?
Yeah, because I'll have to get off after this. I mean, I think it's a little bit hard. I mean, I think that the Democratic Party also has they're not in danger of a split like the Republicans, but they also have an identity crisis. There's a lot of social progressives who want to privilege very vigorous legislation for, dignity of higher quality of life, dignity of life, everything from Green New Deal to, more equitable wages. And I think that this sweeping kind of approach, which does address the hardship of many Americans and the desperation, isn't necessarily embraced by some of the more establishment figures. So I think that while they've done it's hard to answer because Trump, there was so much obstructionism, and then they inevitably ended up reacting to this assault on institutions and democracy that the GOP waged. So this will be the test now with Biden coming in to see what their response will fully be. But we do know that there's an appetite for that response, and that's that. Look at also what happened in Georgia and addressing issues of anti-violence, and racial equity, very, very important for the health of the nation, because many people felt it can't go on, things can't go on like they were. And I think that's why, just to be optimistic again, people voted under very difficult circumstances with, voter suppression and threats in some cases, and the pandemic, and yet they got out there to vote, not only nationally, but again in Georgia. So I'll end there, and thanks to everybody.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks,
Klaus, could I just make a comment on that last question?
Yes, absolutely.
In addition to white supremacy and to the evangelical problem, we also have a problem that permeates every township, every home, every residence, every region, every county, every parish. And that's the maldistribution of wealth in this country, which is worse than it was in 1929. And if the Democrats in particular, but both parties in general, don't approach that and don't do something about it pretty soon, there are going to be a lot more people opposed to the government in Washington, and in more significant ways. As Thomas Piketty has pointed out in his two books, Capitalism in the 21st Century and now Capital and Ideology, you might not want to go as far as Thomas does in his conclusion in his latest book, but we need an entirely new economic model, we being the globe, and we need to lead it because we are the #1 economic power, we and China together. If we don't do something about that, if we don't reduce the class divisions in this country, and what Ruth said is right, that Democrats put Bernie Sanders, who was as attractive as Trump in 2016, and indeed might have beaten him, largely because of this disaffection for government because of the situation with wealth in this country, the disparity in wealth. It's a problem we've got to deal with, or we can kiss it goodbye, I think.
How would you deal with it?
Well, you've got to do some of the things. I might not think that you could be as utopian as Piketty is in his conclusion, but you do have to adjust the model that we're using for our economics right now. And there are some suggestions in that book that I think are quite good. And interestingly, there are suggestions coming in from other economists. Milton Friedman should be put away. We need an entirely new model. And it might not be a model that includes, quote, growth, unquote. It might be a model that looks at economic success in an entirely different way, because growth is leading us to the destruction of this planet. We can't sustain it. So we need it existentially as well as we need it politically.
Tim, do you agree with that?
Well, I absolutely agree that that when globalization and free trade were sold to populations throughout the world, but we're talking about the United States, the downside of that wasn't shared. Free trade is actually a superb approach if people are willing to move, because jobs don't stay. But we didn't tell people that. We said to everybody, it's going to benefit all of you, and you're going to enjoy access to more goods, and they're going to be cheaper. But the dirty little secret was, yes, if you moved and if you retrained. So we sold a fantasy, and that's a fantasy sold on the left and the right, because in a sense we had a national consensus, with the exception of the Reform Party. We had a bipartisan consensus about the importance of free trade, and so part of the reason why the so-called elite lost credibility was it didn't deliver on the promises it made. And these were promises from both Republicans and Democrats. And these were made starting really in the 80s, the 90s, and up to the Great Recession. We are still dealing with the political consequences of the Great Recession. We are still dealing with the racial consequences of the end of Reconstruction. The 60s started the process, made great gains, but didn't finish it because of the backlash of the 70s that both the Colonel and I have been talking about. So these are processes that need to be understood and discussed. And my hope comes from the fact that not only are people voting, but young people are running for office. And the future for us is in more people running for office and a generation that has been fighting, and I'm not an ageist, okay, but we've actually had the baby boom generation dominate our national discussion in Washington for a very long time. And in many ways, they're still fighting about Vietnam. And a lot of the issues, the way they frame them, are products of either the end of the Cold War or that first 10 years after the Cold War ended. It's time for new blood, and it's time to talk about issues like a living wage and about a living environment. And the people we have with power in Washington are frankly of a different generation. These are issues that are not really at the core of how they view their public service. Now, I'm not suggesting that every young person under the age of 30 who's running will be running with the kind of empirical approach and pragmatic approach that I would prefer, but it's not up to me. But the fact you have new blood will be a source, I think, will shake up the system. And some of Trumpism will disappear, some of it, as this new generation comes in. But I certainly agree with the Colonel that white supremacy is a problem deeply ingrained in our history. And income inequality is a problem that we were beginning to lick. If you look at our Gini coefficient in the 70s, we were getting much better. We've now gone right back to the 1920s. So
thank you.
We can do something. Anyway, I've got to go too, but thank you very much. I wanted to mention, I was never director of the Miller Center. The very talented Philip Zellico was, but I ran a tapes project there.
Then I misread.
Thank you very much
for joining us today. Larry, do you have a few more minutes for us to stay and answer a few more questions?
Yeah, I planned on your time.
That's very good of you, because we have plenty of questions waiting for you. And now you can answer all of them by yourself.
Oh, jeez. You help me.
Okay, I will try. Pete, would you ask another question?
Yes, the stage has been set. First off, special thanks again to Dr. Ben-Ghiat and Dr. Naftali for their contributions today. There's been a lot of questions about impeachment, Colonel. Mike Bennett, who's a retired U.S. diplomat based in Cary, is asking, if the Senate does eventually convict the president, will it then require a separate second motion to ban him from seeking any federal office for life? And Mr. Bennett is also inquiring as to what the punishment looks like. It's hard to, remove a president that is no longer president, since it looks like impeachment's going to happen after Biden is inaugurated. So will he lose his presidential perks? For example, his post-presidency staff, Secret Service protection, his pension, etc. What does that look like?
Those are good questions. And as far as I know, and we have been discussing some of that in the last 48 hours, and some of these people are lawyers who know constitutional law and other law better than I. But as far as I know, this is unplowed ground. So the precedents that will be, now not removal from office through the process of impeachment, and yes, it does take a second vote to ensure that the person is not able to run for federal office again. At least that's the way I understood it today. But these other things are there to be determined. It will be what is decided in terms of law and statute and precedent and protocol by those who do these kinds of deciding, mostly the Supreme Court and the Congress making the law and the Supreme Court ruling whether it's constitutional or not. But I think basically the answer is unplowed ground.
Thank you. Colin Powell told us that he doesn't regard himself anymore as a member of the Republican Party. You were his chief of staff, you're a member of the party, the Republican Party yourself. Do you agree with what he is saying, or do you believe one has to rebuild from within rather than from without?
Well, I worked for him off and on for almost 16 years, and I must say that I regretted his statement to that effect. I understood it. I particularly understand it from the point of view of, I know his wife in the kitchen every day was probably harassing him to do just that. Alma is a fine woman, and she was probably doing that. How can you stay in that party? I get it all the time. I get it from friends. I get it from people who just send me an email and say, how can you be a Republican and say the things you say? And I try to respond to every email, and I say, we need two parties. And I am a Republican of the party of Lincoln and the party of Eisenhower. And I want to see that party restored. And then I tell them about all the young people I meet in places like Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, in places like Houston, Texas, in Des Moines, Iowa, 40 years old and younger, successful people, man and woman. And they want the Republican Party back too. And they're working. One of the groups in Coeur d'Alene, for example, told me they want to throw the bastards out in Boise. I said, well, why are you so angry with Republicans in Boise? And they said, it's really clear. They don't like clean water. They don't like public land. And that's how we survive. That's how we make our money. People coming in to hunt and fish, and people coming in to do their bit in terms of Idaho's got the most incredible terrain on the planet in some respects. It has outer space in some areas, and it has deep, deep mountain passes, and it has the Snake River and so forth. They want to protect that. And they're Republicans, and they don't like the people in Boise because they're defiling all of that. So it'll take a while, it'll take time, but I think we need two parties.
Let me press you. So you think it is possible to rebuild the Republican Party rather than give up on it and found a new second party?
I don't know what you do if you give up on it. You go out and you try to form a party, another party, despite the Whigs and the radicals and such of the past. I just don't see how you get to that today. Change the name, okay, and let's get some different people in it and so forth and so on, or keep the people that I was just talking about. But basically, I think Republicans and Democrats are here to stay, and let's fix the Republican Party.
Okay, Will, do you have another question for us?
Yes, Elaine Marshall asks for a short overview of Trump's last-minute foreign policy changes and what potential issues this could create for the Biden administration.
Yes,
terrific question.
Of course, the Secretary of State for North Carolina, and she knows a lot about politics herself, obviously.
Please jump in. My two huge concerns right now, besides the situation we've created in Venezuela, the situation we're creating and still working on to make worse in Syria, the situation we've created with the Saudis in Yemen, and a number of other places. Right now, our relationship with the French in Mali is turning really sour in North Africa, in the Sahel. But the two I'm really worried about, that Pompeo has just placed these landmines out, are Iran and foreclosing any possibility that President Biden might be able to restart the business that Obama left off. Not just the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, but also what they were envisioning, that leading to a wider dialogue with Iran that would deal with terrorism, would deal with ballistic missiles and so forth and so on, and regional stability in general. But the one that really frightens me, I highlighted earlier, is Taiwan. This business of strategic ambiguity worked for 40 plus years, as Ambassador Chaz Freeman, who was with Nixon and Kissinger when they met with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai in Beijing. It's lasted and it's worked, and now we're destroying it. We have strategic clarity. It's not the time to have strategic clarity. The Chinese could take Taiwan in a heartbeat. They won't do that. They will just bring such pressure to bear on Taipei that Taipei will have to surrender, much the way they have done inexpertly and stupidly, in my view, but it's worked with Hong Kong. Only we'll have 23 million people living in a reasonably successful democracy now falling under the sway of Beijing. it's going to happen. And are we going to ask the American people to go to war with China when that happens? That's the conundrum that Pompeo, I think, is leaving for President Biden and Secretary Blinken. And I must reiterate what was said earlier, too. Pompeo has destroyed diplomacy. He's destroyed the State Department in many respects, from consular affairs to economic affairs to political affairs to public diplomacy. He's just ransacked it. And like an army sergeant, it takes about 13 years to build one. And it takes that long to build a good diplomat and to build a good diplomatic corps and good diplomacy. So he's done irreparable damage in many respects. It will take a long time to fix it.
But the policy towards and with Taiwan could be reversed by the new administration without too much difficulties.
I don't know how you do it once you've said it to Taiwan and Taiwan has accepted it, and they have readily accepted it, far too readily. And Beijing has heard it and seen it, and you can try, but it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to walk that back. Hard with the Congress even, especially the Republicans in the Congress.
Yeah, no, you're quite right. Pete, a quick question, please.
Trump has complained of the deep state since his rise. Are we now seeing a Trumpian deep state emerge today? And this is from Brian Keeler.
I think the talk that's occurred tonight, with which most of the points of which I wholeheartedly agree, demonstrates otherwise. I think this is as was said by one of the other speakers, this is more like the Italy of Mussolini. It's not really a deep state so much as it is an attempt at authoritarian state. The deep state is with us. Mike Lofgren, sort of, himself a 30-year plus Republican staffer in the Congress, really coined that phrase. And what Mike meant by that were the oligarchs, if you will, the plutocrats, the people behind the scene. They don't care whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. They care if they own them or they own parts of them. And Congress is a wholly owned subsidiary of them. And that's a real problem, I think. And Trump promised to do something about that. Remember, he promised to drain the swamp. Well, there are more crocodiles in that swamp right now than there were when he came to Washington, and they love it. And he gave them all a tax cut too. So this is a problem that's going to be around for a while, and it's exacerbated by what I talked about earlier, this maldistribution of wealth. And AI, artificial intelligence, and robotics are going to give them a new tool that will do what predatory capitalists have always wanted to do: eliminate the most costly aspect of their activities, labor. Robotics and artificial intelligence will give them the ability to eliminate labor. That's a dismal future.
Thank you. Will, the next question.
Let's see, Stephen Kennedy asked, could a move toward European-style proportional representation in government or ranked choice voting ease political tensions in the U.S.? And could it help people who feel disenfranchised or as if they lack political choice feel more represented in American government?
I think the latter could. Maine is sort of proving that. I think we have one or two other states that are experimenting with it or have put it in place. The former, I'm not sure. That would take a monumental movement. I'm not sure that we're capable of doing that, and I'm not sure you could sell it. We're working, a group I'm working with, are working on an amendment to the Constitution that would more or less reverse Citizens United. That is to say, the states would begin this. By the way, we have 24 of the 38 required states right now who've signed up to this. But once you get to the point where you're about to that total, the Congress will take it over, because the Congress doesn't want the states writing it. They want to write it. So the two ways to amend the Constitution are through the Congress or through the states. The Congress would then probably take it over, and we'd have to watch carefully how they wrote it. But I think that's one of the things we need to do that would make perhaps the former not necessary. Because if you get rid of Citizens United, you get rid of this polluting money in politics. And I agree with the last thing John McCain said about that. That's the biggest problem we have. The biggest problem we have with regard to politics right now is not necessarily the people in it. It's the pollution that comes into those people's way because of the money that can be applied to it. Look at the money. We're just doing this in the task force, state by state, that was spent on the 3 November elections. Look at the billions that were spent on the election in Georgia, the 5 January elections in Georgia. This is not the way we should be doing business. This is polluting, it's corrupting the Supreme Court. That decision, Citizens United, was the worst decision since the Dred Scott decision. It's a terrible decision and it needs to be reversed. And if the court won't reverse it, then we reverse it through a constitutional amendment.
And imagine what could be done with that money instead.
Oh, yes.
Thank you. Steve, sorry, Pete, would you ask the next question? We are running out of time gradually. Let's have a few questions and then we need to call it the end of the evening.
Yes, this question is from Diane Kirby. In terms of criminality, is Trump in any worse legal situation than Nixon was with the Watergate scandal and with Reagan during the Iran-Contra scandal? How does
Diane
that
is
look
joining us from Belfast in Northern Ireland. So we have a global audience here.
Oh, great. You know, that's a good question too. I think, of course, President Ford came in and ruined his chances for re-election and pardoned Richard Nixon. President Reagan was as vulnerable, I think, I teach this particularly, the Iran-Contra affair. I think President Reagan was as vulnerable as Richard Nixon to impeachment, and the articles were being contemplated and even, I'm told by some, worked on. But his remarkable speech where he essentially said, I didn't know what was going on, but I should have, or words to that effect, saved him. The great communicator actually used that particular proclivity of his and saved himself. And so there wasn't any really necessity for a pardon. With Trump, I think the situation again is going to be untraversed ground. We're just going to have to work with it. I had a argument with one of our constitutional lawyers. I shouldn't have, because Ned Foley and some others, Ned from Ohio State University, are just priceless in their knowledge of constitutional law and so forth. You know, I thought you had to have a crime to be pardoned. And he got this Washington Post article out and showed it to me. And I think it was a decision made in 1868 or something like that. It said, oh, no, you can be pardoned for an anticipated crime. And I'm thinking, how do you do due process? I mean, if you don't have due process, if you don't have a conviction, how can you have a pardon? You could pocket pardons forever. So this is arcane law, and I certainly don't know anything about it, but it is unplowed ground again, I think, with regard to what you can do with pardons. And Trump is going to plow that ground as far as he possibly can. And I suspect for his whole family, Jared Kushner and the whole gang.
Mm-hmm. And you think it will stand up in court?
I think it's going to be up to both the courts and the Congress
mm-hmm.
as to whether it does or not.
Yeah, we are expecting a wave of pardons soon, are we not?
Yeah. New York State, of course. I think I'm hearing from lawyers in New York that come hell or high water, they're going to try him, and they don't care about federal law, and they don't have to. So,
mm-hmm. Good. Will.
So Garrett McKinnon asks, in regard to your comments about wealth and economic inequality, do you see policies like universal basic income as a potential solution to these inequalities?
That's a good question too. UBI bothers me in many respects. I can't cast off my father, who was a Sears and Roebuck executive and a believer in the capitalist system and the capitalist method. I can say that I think as we talk about a new economic model and we talk about transition, I think the first thing we need to do is probably restore the health of capitalism in general. And the way I see you do that is you make unions more powerful. We've just decimated our unions, and that's making labor more powerful, and you make government regulation more powerful and more executed, more actually oversight, in other words. We've destroyed that. We've destroyed the power of the labor unions, and indeed those that remain are in cahoots with the big business they are supposed to represent for their labor force. And we've destroyed regulation. And I blame Bill Clinton and Bob Rubin and the Democrats principally for having done this. If you don't have a good check on big business, on predatory capitalism, if you don't make it become just capitalism, and you don't have a robust labor movement and good government oversight to do that, then you're just asking for the kind of maldistribution of wealth that we have today. Now, whether you have to do that in order to transition into this new economic model, whatever that might be, or go right into the new economic model because climate change is going to force us to, I can't answer. I suspect that the climate crisis is going to force us into a new economic model before we go back to some form of capitalism that's more susceptible to less class struggle and so forth. So my answer would be, I think the climate crisis is going to compel us to have an entirely new economic model, or we're going to depart this planet.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Craig Horn asked a question about the IMT, and Craig Horn is one of our legislators in Raleigh. And he asked a question in how far the COVID-19 crisis has influenced the riots we saw in Washington, D.C. and the general discontent in the country we have seen for the last year. How would you judge that influence?
That's a good question too. And we could have talked about that earlier, maybe got some better insight than I will be able to render. But what I see is that being used as a part of Trump's toolkit. Most of the people that are Trump's base believe it's a hoax. They even believe the vaccine is a hoax, or the vaccines, plural, I should say. I was somewhat heartened the other day when I saw pictures of lines in Texas of people getting vaccinations, until I realized the last time I was in Texas, I found there were a good 40% of Texans in the different places I went who didn't like Trump at all. And not necessarily the Democrats in Texas, but independents as well, who detested him. And so maybe that's who I saw in line out there. But basically, this base, this core base in particular, seems to think that the COVID-19 pandemic is a hoax and that it was generated basically by the Democrats and their allies in the medical community and at places like the World Health Organization in order to ruin Trump's administration.
Thank you. Let's have two more questions, one asked by Pete and one asked by Will, and then we'll need to find out about your personal story about the 25th Amendment at the end, because you haven't told us that story, I believe.
Can I do mine now? I want to make it a follow-up to that question about COVID. How do you explain, if at all, the overlap between a lot of people on the right or Trump supporters that believe the COVID-19 pandemic to be a hoax? And then, we talked about Trump being sort of a godhead figure, but he's been one of the primary champions of the vaccine. But now you're seeing a lot of the same people who believed the pandemic's a hoax saying that the vaccine is no good and that there are conspiracies surrounding the vaccine. Do you have any intuitions around that?
My concern about many of the group that constitute Trump's core base, and to a certain extent some of the periphery of that base, is that they seem to be able to harbor opposite ideas at the same time and be in favor of both. I have a great problem, for example, understanding why people would vote against their own economic interests, which they are clearly doing with regard to the massive tax cuts that Trump gave, and then trumpeted as being beneficial to everyone when it's clear that they weren't. They were most beneficial to the richest people in the country, which was his intent, of course. And yet these people don't seem to understand that that's not in their interest. In fact, it's in their direct disinterest that he did that. they have a capacity to maintain these opposing ideas and not let it decrement their worshipfulness of Trump. That's the only way I can explain it, other than there's a real mixed bag, particularly in places where I got to right before the pandemic broke out, and places that I've looked at since through other virtual means, in the way people think about this COVID-19 and the way Trump has managed it from the point of view of China having started it and using that as a refrain, to the point of view of finally realizing that maybe he needed to do something positive, and the quickest way to do something positive was to go for a vaccine, to recognize that it was a pandemic, it was killing people, and he needed to go for a vaccine. It gave him something to say. We'll have a vaccine by Christmas, and that sort of thing. I don't know if he ever believed in it. I mean, he had the disease himself, if we're to believe our own eyes, and he got through it. He got through it with the best health care in the country. There's another story too. Is the best health care in the country available to a Black person in Southern Mississippi? Of course not. So has that person got a completely different reality staring at them with COVID-19 than Donald Trump did, or for that matter, any wealthy person in this country does? The healthcare system favors the wealthy, as we all know. Even the middle class knows that. So I don't know how you explain all this, other than it's extremely complex, and you almost have to go individual by individual as to why do you go get a vaccine when you think the COVID-19 virus is a hoax. And you'll probably get a different set of answers from a different set of people.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Pete.
Approximately 70 million people voted for President Trump in the 2020 election. Do you believe many of those people are having second thoughts since January 6th? And how does a Biden administration move forward in trying to bring those people in uniting the country?
Watch Fox News for 6 or 7 hours, or even an hour if you get the right shows, and you will see that the media that most influences them, and I must say amongst CNN, MSNBC, CBS, and NBC, the media that has the most viewers. You know, look at the statistics. They have the most viewers all over the South. You go into any Dairy Queen, any Wendy's, any McDonald's in the South, TV's 90% of the time going to be turned to Fox. And they will scream at you if you get up to turn it to some other channel. That's telling them essentially the answer to your question. They simply have an alternative reality within which they live, and Fox ramifies that for them every day.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. We come to the end of our show tonight. Thank you very much for staying with us. I don't want to let you go without you telling us that personal story about the 25th Amendment, and then perhaps give us your speculation about the future and the Biden administration. How successful, how unsuccessful will that administration be?
Well, the personal story actually, I gotta be careful here. It concerns Trump. It concerns the vice president's youngest daughter, who turns out to be, as one Marine put it to me, fairly liberal. And so we thought perhaps we could, through her, get the vice president to be convinced that the 25th Amendment should be invoked, and that he should be amenable to that and forceful in doing that. And it didn't work. It didn't work for a number of reasons, which I won't go into. But one of the things that it taught me was, don't use your close friends for such delicate tasks. I should have known better anyway. To your more comprehensive question, I think in the short term, I hope we get through the next few days without more repetitions of the 6th of January. I'm really worried by what I mentioned about the FBI monitoring so many cases that by law they should be examining thoroughly, and they can't. It's logistically impossible. And are they missing a lot of the people they should be looking at because of that, and therefore not being able to preempt some of the things that might happen out in the States? I'm really worried about Georgia, really worried about Georgia. Where do we go as a country? You know how I feel about that. I think we are an empire in search of an off-ramp. And if we don't find that off-ramp from being an imperial hegemon in the world, I think we're in trouble. And as some of the others said tonight, particularly Timothy, I think my students and the some 500 or so students I've taught on 2 campuses in the last 16 years are building that off-ramp. And I'm glad they're doing it. And they're doing it with some animosity for my generation, which Timothy also sort of hinted at. We've screwed it up. We've screwed it up badly, particularly with regard to the emerging and coming down the train track fairly fast right now, climate crisis. And they know that. And they know that we are making their lives more challenging than they should be, possibly more miserable than they should be, more difficult than they should be. And so they're ready to grab the reins of power. They're ready to go. And they don't want to have anything to do with this business of endless wars. They don't want to have anything to do with this business of rape, pillage, and plunder as the empire goes about its peripheral duties. They don't want to have anything to do with 800 military bases all over the world when the rest of the world together has less than 80. They want to end that. And I say more power to them.
So
I think
isolationism is going to stay?
I don't think it's isolationism so much as it is a realization that we got to do this together or we won't do it. And when I say together, they understand that China has to be a part of it. They understand that India has to be a part of it. They understand that if we're going to get through this February, when we're supposed to renew the New START agreement with Putin, that we better do it, regardless of our angst with Putin, that we better get back to nuclear arms control, or that might be an immediate crisis that negates even the climate crisis, because there won't be any climate to worry about. Nuclear weapons are back, and they're back with a vengeance, and we're losing arms control. Losing it treaty by treaty by treaty. And this one coming up for renewal in February is probably the last big one to lose. These young people are smart, they're energetic, and they're fed up that we've messed things up, and they're ready to take the reins and they're ready to change things.
But reportedly, the Biden administration will also be so-called tough on China. That doesn't sound promising regarding world cooperation, which you tried to hope for.
Yeah, I'm a little bit worried about that. I'm particularly worried about the prospective Secretary of State's views in that regard, and the president's, as you intimated. But I think cooler heads will prevail once they get in and get all the briefings and understand where we are, for example, with Taiwan, and move to try and do something to ameliorate that situation a bit, to maybe pick up that landmine and put it aside, carefully. They're going to have to do that. If they don't, then I change my predictions.
Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, thank you very much for being our guest today, together with Ruth Ben-Ghiat and Timothy Naftali, of course. It was a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for your insights. You have been with the Krasno Events Series before. I hope you will come back and don't let us wait for too long to be back and give us your insights. But thank you very much for coming to see us tonight. And I would like to mention that, of course, we have recorded the session. It will be available on our YouTube channel within a day or two, as we always do. And you find all the other shows going back to 2012 on our famous and popular YouTube channel, youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. And our next event is on the 3rd of February, and that will be the former Australian Foreign Minister and the Premier of New South Wales, that is the Honourable Bob Carr. And Bob Carr will give us an overview of the world he expects to see in 2021, the problems, the challenges, and hopefully also a few good things which we can see in 2021. That is the Honourable Bob Carr, former Australian Foreign Minister, on February the 3rd, which is a Wednesday, 5:30 p.m. Thank you very much to everyone, to you again, Larry, to the audience, to Pete and Will, and for everyone who has supported, shown his and her loyalty tonight. Thank you very much. See you on the February the 3rd. Thank you.